The low hum of late evening traffic drifted across the suburban streets of West London, a familiar soundtrack to the lives woven through its terraced houses, corner shops, and quiet cul-de-sacs. Nothing in the soft glow of street lamps suggested anything sinister, no warning curled in the air, no omen in the warm breeze pushing crisp packets along the pavement. West London, especially the boroughs straddling Twickenham, Hounslow, and Richmond, had always carried the gentle illusion of safety. It was a place where children walked home from school in uniforms too big for them, where the elderly left their windows open in summer, and where the streets at night felt almost drowsy. Yet this calm would gradually mask one of the most chilling patterns of criminal behavior the country had ever confronted. The figure who moved in this darkness was not a ghost, nor a myth whispered about in pubs. He was a man many had brushed past, bargained with, or waved at with casual politeness. A man known for loans offered with a grin, for odd jobs done at short notice, for being one of the lads. A familiar face in the locality, burly, shaved-headed, tough-looking, but always ready with a joke. Levi Bellfield, a man whose outward normalcy camouflaged something deeply corrosive within. Before the name "bus stop killer" echoed across headlines and television screens, Bellfield's story started like so many others. Born into a working-class family, raised in the kind of environment often described as rough around the edges, and shaped by early experiences that would, in hindsight, seem like warning signs. Teachers remembered a boy with a streak of aggression, a knack for trouble, someone who bristled at authority and brimming with resentment he never quite shook off. His mother worked hard to hold the family together, while Levi and his siblings navigated a household that sometimes throbbed with tension and instability. But childhoods rarely point with certainty toward futures. Many who grow up in similar circumstances go on to forge stable, peaceful lives. And for years, Bellfield presented a version of himself that could, superficially, pass for ordinary. He found work where he could, security jobs, wheel clamping, small-time business ventures, and forged friendships that often circled around drinking, bragging, and nighttime wanderings. He acquired a reputation as a heavy-handed bloke who liked to throw his weight around but wasn't, at that point, considered dangerous. Even those who disliked him rarely imagined the depths to which he could descend. By the early 2000s, West London found itself the stage for a sequence of attacks that baffled investigators. These weren't the types of crimes that exploded suddenly in dramatic violence. They were more like a shadow crawling slowly from one borough to the next. Something felt off. Something felt wrong. Yet there was no clear villain, no pattern that detectives could grasp firmly. Fear spread quietly, like mist settling over pavements, especially among young women who frequently used public transport after dark. The first signs came in the form of reports, trembling voices on the phone describing a man lurking near bus stops, following women as they walked home, or circling in a van with its headlights dimmed. Some encounters ended without incident. A stranger's stare, a few steps quickened, a bus arriving just in time. Other encounters left injuries, confusion, and trauma. But the randomness of it all, the varying ages of victims, the different locations, the shifting methods, made police unsure whether they were dealing with a single offender or a string of unrelated crimes fueled by the unpredictable dangers of a city at night. The newspapers, when they caught wind of some of these incidents, reduced them to brief columns buried among broader stories, sometimes printed as warnings or appeals for information. Woman assaulted near bus stop. Girl followed by unknown man in white van. Police seek witnesses after unprovoked attack. They were grim, but they didn't command public panic. People imagined they were isolated events, the sort of terrible but sporadic acts that occur in every city. But in the quiet corners of police stations, especially those cramped offices illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights, a few detectives felt uneasy. Something threaded these reports together. A type of vehicle described repeatedly. A manner of approach that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. A victim profile that, while not identical, bore unsettling similarities. These early concerns were largely private murmurs, the hunches of individuals who had seen enough cases to sense when the surface didn't match the depths. While officers wrestled with confusion, Bellfield lived a life that oscillated between ordinary routines and violent impulses. Friends later recalled how he could switch from jovial to explosive with little provocation. Relationships with women were marked by control, jealousy, and sudden bursts of aggression. He seemed to live with an internal tension, a simmering hostility that found targets easily. Women, drivers, nightclub doormen, and sometimes strangers who crossed his path by accident. One of the women who had known him during these years spoke later of the unpredictable atmosphere around him. "You never knew which version of him you were going to get," she said in an interview. "Sometimes he was charming, funny, generous. Then something would flip and he'd go cold. His eyes would go blank like lights turning off, and it made you feel like you were standing next to someone you didn't know at all." Despite this volatility, Bellfield maintained an air of normalcy that tricked those around him. He bought vans and sold them, hired himself out for small gigs, and visited pubs with mates who mostly saw him as loud but harmless. But beneath the surface, his resentment toward women, particularly young, attractive women, was quietly sharpening. He seemed to cultivate grudges against them without reason, projecting his insecurities, failures, and obsessions into a dangerous, festering hatred. For Scotland Yard, the turning point came when the scattered incidents escalated into something impossible to ignore. A young woman was attacked near a bus stop in a manner disturbingly similar to earlier reports. She survived, though with emotional scars that lingered long after. What made her case particularly alarming was the precision of the attack. The attacker had observed her, waited for a moment when she was alone, and struck with sudden, ruthless force. There was no attempt at robbery. No verbal confrontation, just violence. This incident landed on the desk of Detective Inspector Daniel Fraser, a seasoned officer with years of experience in violent crime. Fraser was not easily rattled, but something about the case nagged at him. When he cross-referenced notes from earlier attacks, he spotted patterns that others had overlooked, details insignificant on their own but chilling when linked together. The geographical clustering around bus stops, the timing late at night, the similar build of the attacker described by witnesses, and the presence of a white van in multiple cases. Fraser began forming a theory, though at first it felt like trying to complete a puzzle with most pieces missing. He spoke with colleagues, some of whom agreed quietly while others remained skeptical. Without enough conclusive evidence, building an official case around a suspected serial offender was risky. Mistakes could send investigations spiraling in the wrong direction, and public panic was something authorities always sought to avoid. Still, Fraser persisted. He coordinated with officers from neighboring stations, organized the compilation of witness statements, and pushed for deeper reviews of CCTV footage. The work was painstaking, each new file a potential lead or a dead end. The pressure weighed heavily, especially as more reports surfaced. Every fresh call from a frightened woman walking home at night felt like confirmation that something far more calculated was unfolding. Meanwhile, Bellfield moved through London with growing confidence in his ability to evade attention. He had become adept at reading the environment, the blind spots in CCTV networks, the predictable patterns of bus routes, and the isolated pockets of suburbia where the glow of street lamps failed to reach. He had an instinct for opportunistic violence, choosing moments when his target was alone, vulnerable, and unaware of his presence until it was too late. He cultivated multiple vehicles, often selling or abandoning them before police could consider them evidence. He used pay-as-you-go mobile phones, changed his routine frequently, and avoided activities that might raise suspicions among acquaintances. His familiarity with the area, its shortcuts, alleyways, and transport routes, was a key advantage, and his outward persona, though intimidating at times, was not one that anyone readily connected with a series of violent attacks on women. The people who knew him personally were blind to the pattern, partly because they never connected the assaults to someone within their social circle, and partly because Bellfield was careful. He did not brag, did not hint, did not display trophies or souvenirs. His arrogance came not from boastfulness, but from the certainty that he was smarter than investigators, that he was in control, and that his victims were mere opportunities, their pain irrelevant to his sense of dominance. By late 2003, the tension in West London had become almost palpable. Stories circulated among women, warnings passed through college corridors, whispered conversations at bus stops, advice shared on nights out: don't walk home alone. Check who's behind you, stay in the light, avoid that side of the street. Some dismissed the rumors as paranoia, while others changed their routines entirely. And in the heart of this growing unease, Bellfield continued to prowl. It was around this time that the first major threads began tying themselves firmly into Fraser's hands. A witness from one of the earlier attacks came forward again after recalling additional details. Her account, though still fragmented by trauma, mentioned a man with a distinctive build and van. Another case involved a victim who had noticed the same van circling twice before she was approached. These small moments, irrelevant to many, were golden to a detective who had spent months assembling fragments. Fraser pushed harder now. He requested deeper trawls through vehicle registries. He liaised with officers monitoring known offenders in the area, though none matched what he suspected. He expanded his team's working hours, sometimes staying long after others had gone home. The walls of his office gradually filled with maps connected by strings, lists of incidents sorted by date and location, and photographs of suspects that were eventually crossed off one by one. Behind every pinned note was a woman whose life had been jolted off its natural path, a reminder that this was not merely an investigation, but a race against a predator who seemed to understand his environment better than anyone chasing him. Bellfield, meanwhile, grew restless. The violence for him was not random but rooted in an emotional compulsion he couldn't articulate. Each attack temporarily quelled the storm within him, only for it to return, more intense and demanding. His personal relationships deteriorated under the pressure of his unpredictability. Partners grew fearful of his temper. Friends noticed changes in his behavior. He drank more heavily. He became less patient, more irritable. Yet none of them suspected the true cause of his instability. The duality of his life, ordinary on the surface, monstrous beneath, began stretching him thin. Still, he pressed deeper into the shadows, convinced that he was untouchable, convinced that he had mastered the art of disappearing into the texture of the city. But the city was watching, and so was Fraser. Detective Inspector Daniel Fraser stepped into the operations room just after dawn, the scent of stale coffee lingering in the air. The night shift had left stacks of printouts, highlighted witness statements, and CCTV timestamps waiting for him. These early hours had become his rhythm, quiet moments before the station stirred fully to life, where he could examine the threads of the case without interruption. He stared again at the wall that had grown into a visual map of fear, red pins marking one attack, blue for another, and yellow for sightings that might mean everything or nothing. Together, they traced a jagged shape across West London, like a wound spreading without clean edges. The troubling thing was how fluid the pattern seemed. It wasn't a neat geographical radius or a predictable route. Instead, it was a web, one that suggested an offender who wasn't simply opportunistic but mobile, adaptive, and intimately familiar with the area's transportation networks. Bus routes, terminals, night schedules, gaps in surveillance. The sort of details only a local or someone who had spent years navigating these areas would know instinctively. Fraser rubbed his eyes, weighed down by fatigue. Every pin represented not just an incident but a moment where a woman had felt terror spill into her life. He had interviewed several of them personally, each account adding pressure to his chest. Some victims struggled to remember precise details, their minds protecting them by blurring the most traumatic parts. Others recalled the assailant's presence vividly, yet couldn't name the features that mattered. Trauma was an unreliable witness, he reminded himself, but a truthful one. The fear in their voices told him that something larger was at play. He reached for the report from the most recent attack, one that had taken place near a quiet bus stop in Twickenham. The victim, a university student returning home after an evening out with friends, survived only due to two passers-by who unknowingly interrupted the assault when their laughter echoed down the street. She described a white van, a heavy-set man, a sense that she had been watched long before she realized anything was wrong. The attack was quick, brutal, and without attempt at theft or conversation, pure violence. As Fraser read through her testimony again, a uniformed constable entered, holding a stack of papers. "Another call came in this morning, sir. Suspicious activity near a bus stop in Hounslow. No attack this time, just a woman who said a van slowed down repeatedly as she walked." "A white van?" Fraser asked without looking up. "Yeah, she didn't catch the plate." Fraser sighed. It was another data point, but still not enough. He thanked the officer and turned back to the board. Something was tightening. He could feel it. Meanwhile, several miles away, Levi Bellfield rolled out of bed in the flat he shared with his then-partner. The room was dark except for a sliver of early morning light slipping past the curtains. Bellfield stretched, wincing at aches he couldn't, or wouldn't, explain. His partner stirred but didn't speak. She had long learned not to ask questions on mornings when he woke with that particular tension in his shoulders. Bellfield moved automatically through his morning routine. Coffee, cigarette, a long, silent stare out the window as if the world outside irritated him simply by existing. His partner watched him from the kitchen doorway. She could never predict which version of him she would face that day. The quiet, brooding man who buried himself in daily errands, or the irritable, unpredictable one who snapped at the slightest comment. He spoke little, finishing his drink and grabbing his keys. "Work," he muttered, though she didn't ask what that meant. With Bellfield, work could be anything: clamping cars, doing odd jobs, buying and selling vehicles, or simply roaming the streets in a restless haze. The specifics didn't matter. Questioning him often led nowhere good. His presence at home was unsettling enough. His absence, she sometimes felt, was worse. For Bellfield, the roads of West London were as familiar as the lines on his palm. He had driven them for years, memorizing the shortcuts, the quiet stretches, the places where CCTV didn't reach. He understood how the night flow worked, when buses slowed, when passengers dispersed, when streets fell silent. His days were often spent planning without consciously calling it planning, a habit grown from compulsion rather than strategy. His white vans were an essential part of this. He bought them cheap, sold them quickly, and kept several at a time. They gave him mobility and anonymity. Witnesses described a white van, but never the same plate, never the same model. This system, though born of instinct rather than sophisticated criminal craft, proved frustratingly effective for police trying to narrow their search. Back in the station, Fraser's growing obsession with the case was beginning to attract attention. Colleagues admired his dedication but worried about the toll. Violent crime was grueling enough. A suspected pattern with no clear suspect was a recipe for burnout. Yet Fraser refused to slow down. He couldn't. Something about these attacks, silent, sudden, senseless, clung to him, refusing to loosen its grip. One afternoon, as he sifted through vehicle license queries, another officer, Detective Sergeant Elaine Morton, approached. Morton was sharp, perceptive, and not easily intimidated. "You need to take a break," she said bluntly. Fraser shook his head. "I'll rest when we have a lead." "You've said that for months." He looked at the map again. "And every month we get another victim." Morton followed his gaze to the tangle of pins. "Okay, but we need to work smarter, not just harder. You're treating every white van in London like a smoking gun. What if we're missing something else?" Fraser hesitated. "What do you mean?" "These attacks aren't random. They're planned. He watches them, waits for the right moment. That kind of behavior requires consistency, routine, something he does regularly that puts him near these areas. We should be looking at the offender's life outside the attacks, not just the attacks themselves." Fraser considered her words. It wasn't a new idea, but the way she phrased it struck him differently this time. Routine. Something stable enough to intersect with multiple locations over time. Something that gave Bellfield access to public transport hubs and nighttime foot traffic. He glanced at the stack of job records, neighborhood watch reports, and local business contacts he had yet to scour. Perhaps Morton was right. Maybe the offender wasn't just some aimless predator drifting through the night. Maybe he was someone rooted in the community, someone whose lifestyle naturally placed him near these routes. Someone like a security guard, a bouncer, a wheel clamper. Someone like Bellfield. Bellfield's life during this period was marked by increasing volatility. His relationships fractured under the weight of his insecurities, jealousy, and quick temper. His partners described episodes where he seemed to become someone else entirely, eyes cold, jaw clenched, voice low and monotone. These shifts were unpredictable and often sparked by minor provocations. A misplaced phone, a missed call, a casual conversation with a neighbor that he interpreted as disloyalty. He controlled his partners with emotional manipulation and intimidation. He dictated who they could see, where they could go, and how they should behave. His paranoia grew sharper with time, fed by deep-seated resentments that festered beneath his skin. But despite his personal turmoil, Bellfield maintained the veneer he needed to move freely. He visited pubs where he was known. He laughed loudly. He bought drinks for friends. He complained about his job, the government, the price of cigarettes, anything mundane enough to deflect attention. To most people, he was simply a rough-around-the-edges bloke with a temper, but nothing more. Underneath, the compulsion to exert power over women tightened. He sought a particular kind of victim, young, independent, confident. His resentment toward them was complex and twisted, rooted in feelings of inadequacy that he countered with domination. Their youth and self-assuredness reminded him of everything he felt he lacked. One evening, Bellfield drove aimlessly through the streets of Hounslow, ignoring the radio murmuring in the background. The sky had darkened into a deep blue, and bus stops were beginning to fill with commuters heading home. He watched them pass, studying their faces, their postures, their levels of awareness. He could read unease. He could sense who would be vigilant and who would be distracted by their phones, their music, or their thoughts. He passed one woman, a teenager perhaps, waiting alone. She kept glancing over her shoulder, alert. He moved on. Another woman stood under the glow of a street lamp, scrolling through her phone with headphones in. He slowed slightly, watching. But before he could circle back, a bus turned the corner. She boarded, disappearing into the warm interior glow. Bellfield cursed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The moment had passed. These restless nights were becoming more frequent. His compulsion was less about opportunity now and more about ritual. He favored areas near bus stops with limited visibility, especially where foliage or architectural features created pockets of darkness. His movements became erratic but purposeful, guided by impulses he neither understood nor questioned. While Bellfield prowled, Fraser and Morton expanded their approach. They began tracing employment records, looking for individuals whose jobs placed them near multiple bus routes. They examined businesses that operated late into the night, especially those known for hiring part-time workers with fluctuating hours. They compiled lists of security personnel, nightclub staff, and wheel clampers, jobs that required driving, mobility, and familiarity with neighborhoods spanning several boroughs. One name began surfacing in multiple records, though at first it didn't stand out significantly: Levi Bellfield. He appeared on documents related to vehicle rentals, private security gigs, and minor altercations reported in pubs. Nothing in his records indicated he was a prime suspect, but his repeated proximity to relevant locations caught Morton's attention. "He's not a strong lead," she admitted when presenting the file to Fraser, "but he's interesting. Lives in the area, buys and sells vans, has a history of aggressive behavior, and he's worked night shifts before." Fraser took the file, flipping through it slowly. Bellfield's photo, A stocky man with a shaved head and a defiant expression looked familiar, though he couldn't place where he'd seen it. Something about the man's eyes struck him immediately. There was a hardness there, a simmering hostility barely disguised by the neutral expression. "What about his vehicles?" Fraser asked. Morton replied, "He's owned several white vans over the past few years, sold them quickly. Some were scrapped, others resold privately." Fraser's pulse quickened slightly. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone of anything, but it was enough to watch, enough to investigate quietly. "We'll keep him on the radar," he said, discreetly. Bellfield's behavior grew more reckless as winter approached. The nights lengthened, offering him more darkness to move through, more shadows to inhabit. He changed vehicles, sometimes using one van for only a week before swapping it for another. He grew bolder in his approaches. He stalked victims for longer distances. He lingered near bus stops even when people were present, testing boundaries. One particular night, he followed a woman from a bus stop in Teddington. She walked briskly, sensing something behind her, but each time she turned, Bellfield blended into the darkness or slipped behind a parked car. Her footsteps quickened. She clutched her keys tightly. When she reached her front gate, she fumbled with the lock, panic rising. But a neighbor opened their door at that precise moment, greeting her warmly. Bellfield melted away before he was seen. Encounters like this fed his anger. Being denied the power he craved ignited something violent within him. It made him more determined, more dangerous. At the same time, whispers began circulating among his acquaintances. Some noticed his absences. Others saw the bruises on his knuckles or the dents in his vehicles. One friend joked that Bellfield must be brawling again. Bellfield laughed it off, but the truth simmered beneath the surface. He was unraveling. His partner, increasingly frightened, confided in a friend that she believed something was wrong. "He goes out at night," she whispered. "Late. Sometimes he comes home shaking. Other times he's completely calm, almost relieved. But he never says where he's been." The friend encouraged her to leave. But leaving Bellfield was not simple. His jealousy was intense, his threats subtle but potent. She feared what he would do if she tried to disappear from his life. Meanwhile, Fraser and Morton deepened their quiet investigation into Bellfield. They pulled his employment records, tracked his vehicle transactions, and noted his home address relative to the mapped attacks. Several pins clustered near locations he frequented. Coincidence? Possibly. But Fraser had learned long ago that coincidence was often a mask hiding something deliberate. Still, they lacked evidence. No definitive witness identification. No fingerprints. No CCTV that clearly captured his face in relevant areas. Just patterns and instincts. But instincts had saved lives before. The turning point was approaching. A moment that would shift the investigation from quiet suspicion to urgent pursuit. A moment that would soon transform Bellfield's name from a footnote in a file to the center of a manhunt. The temperature in West London had dipped sharply by early winter, and the nights grew heavier, quiet in a way that almost felt expectant. Detective Inspector Daniel Fraser sensed it each time he stepped outside the station. An uneasy stillness, the sort that often precedes a turning point in an investigation. He didn't know what shape that turning point would take, only that it was coming. Behind closed doors, Fraser and Detective Sergeant Morton had refined their watch list, narrowing suspects down to a handful of names. At the top was Levi Bellfield, not because of conclusive evidence, but because of the constellation of smaller signs, his ownership of multiple white vans, the proximity of his home to several attack locations, and the troubling reports of his violent temper. Even so, Fraser felt torn between urgency and caution. Without direct evidence, their hands were tied. Surveillance resources were limited, and Bellfield blended into the community with practiced ease. But they kept watching him, quietly, patiently. Both detectives hoped it would be enough. Meanwhile, Bellfield's life at home was growing more chaotic. His partner lived in a constant state of tension, her nerves stretched thin by the unpredictability of his moods. Some nights he returned home agitated and restless, packing the flat like a cornered animal. Other nights he seemed eerily calm, as if some internal pressure had been drained in his absence. She stopped asking questions. Fear teaches silence, and Bellfield had become an unspoken threat hanging over every room. On one particularly cold night in February, Bellfield sat in one of his vans, engine idling softly, breath fogging the windshield. The street outside was quiet. A bus had just passed moments earlier, leaving a young woman walking briskly beneath the dim orange glow of the lamps. She didn't notice him at first. Bellfield watched her, grip tightening on the steering wheel. His compulsion simmered again, the twisted cocktail of resentment and desire for control rising like static beneath his skin. But something shifted in him unexpectedly. A car turned the corner, its headlights sweeping across his van. Startled, he quickly pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the darkness. The moment passed, another near miss, another opportunity thwarted by chance. Yet this time it left him uneasy, paranoid even, as if somehow the boundaries around him were tightening. His instincts weren't wrong, because unknown to him, a small, quiet detail had just cracked open the investigation. 2 days later, Morton approached Fraser with a sheet of CCTV stills from a bus route near Teddington. Most were blurry or irrelevant, but one photograph seized Fraser's attention instantly. A white van parked near a bus stop only minutes before a reported sighting of a suspicious man following a woman. "What's the plate?" Fraser asked. Morton handed him the corresponding log. It matches a van recently sold by Bellfield, 3 weeks before this footage, but the buyer claims he didn't pick it up until the following morning. The van was with Bellfield the night of the sighting. Fraser felt the jolt of momentum. Finally, a thread connecting Bellfield to a specific moment in the timeline of incidents. "This doesn't prove he attacked anyone," Morton warned, "but it proves he was there." Fraser nodded slowly. "It's enough to start pressing harder." And press they did. They dug deeper into Bellfield's personal life, interviewed former partners, reviewed police logs of domestic disturbances. Everything pointed toward a man with a deeply embedded pattern of violence, particularly toward women. Not enough for an arrest, but enough for intensified surveillance.